Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. I'm particularly excited to speak today with Owen Eastwood. Owen is one of the most in-demand performance coaches globally. He's worked with a mixture of sports and corporate teams, including the New Zealand All Blacks, Team GB, Manchester City Football Club, South Africa Cricket, England men's football team, Harlequins Rugby, NATO's command group, corporate leaders, and even professional ballet dancers. He has written an international bestseller, Belonging, the Ancient Code of Togetherness, that pulls from Owen's Maori roots to deliver elite-level team building and leadership insights grounded in anthropology and cultural traditions, making them accessible to everyone. A lawyer by background, Owen currently sits on the board of the Harlequins Rugby Club, where he started as a performance coach and was then asked to join the board, blending his unique perspectives on business, sports, and culture to guide their success. And he previously sat on the board of New Zealand Warriors. Owen, you've been a huge inspiration to me personally as a CEO, thinking through how I create a high-performance environment as we scale up Nurole. When I first heard you speak at the School for CEOs, I wrote down what you said word for word and immediately bought your book because I was so taken by your way of thinking. So a huge thank you, first of all, for that and for being on the show today. You most certainly belong in the story of us.
Well, hi, Ollie. Thanks so much. Really looking forward to our chat.
I'd love to kick off with your journey into the boardroom. And I know you're at an early stage, but I'd love to understand the golden threads that have taken you to this point.
I think my whole career has been an unfolding mystery to me, really. I grew up in the South Island of New Zealand. It wasn't until my late 20s that I actually came over to work in London, like a lot of Kiwis do. I was a lawyer and I worked in the city and ultimately became a partner in a city law firm, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And then, became a performance coach quite accidentally. And probably the best way I could explain it would be, once you become a trusted advisor, as you well know, people don't narrow their conversation or the topics, do they? They actually open them up and they start to talk to you about things outside your wheelhouse. So they started to talk to me about things that were bothering them beyond the legal issues. And culture and leadership and dynamics and personalities was always there. So I started to get invited into those conversations, and then after a period of time, they asked me to help, address some of these issues. So that's how I sort of accidentally became a performance coach, but I thoroughly enjoy it. That's what I do full time now. But as well as that trusted advisor, I suppose you then also can get invited into a boardroom if they think you've got something to offer around that. And that's probably why I've had those opportunities.
Well, it's a really inspirational example because I thought with many Nurole members who will sometimes be struggling with how do they get out of their box, and perhaps lawyers of all people get boxed more than most. How's a lawyer ever going to be an exciting person to have in the boardroom? Which I think is very unfair. And we've had some great interviews with people in the past talking about, one of the great skills of lawyers, I think, is distilling complex issues and making them clear, especially in the boardroom when conversations can sometimes run away with themselves. Having that person who can just pull back and say, look, these are the key issues we need to focus on can be really helpful. But were there any sort of conscious strategies that you used to make that transition? Because it's remarkable how, when I first sort of read the bios of who were going to be speaking at that School for CEOs event, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's this lawyer on there. That's not going to be very interesting. And then just being completely shocked, which shows my own terrible prejudices. How did you go about that transition?
Well, it was very reactive. People were coming to me and having conversations, and you work with teams, organizations for many years, and you just build relationships with them. I think the thread, actually, to come back to the original question, the thread that connects it all was coaching. When I was a kid, I was a bit of a coach, and that I was always very concerned about how everybody was feeling and fitting in the environment. I was the one who would organize Sunday afternoon cricket games and call around everybody and get them there. And I wasn't the alpha leader by any means, but I was someone who was very, very aware of, let's be in a great environment. And also, if people were struggling, I just had this natural care around trying to help them. So as a lawyer, I definitely am not going to put myself as an amazing technical lawyer. That's for sure. I think what I was good at was managing clients through difficult and often very emotional issues. And similarly with the team, our legal team, I think I was reasonably good at making them feel like we were working together and making sure they were okay and had what they needed, those type of things. So that they translate into performance coaching, obviously, in an explicit way, is that I still feel like I'm a coach. I think I've always been a coach. It's just my job title's changed. So the lawyering bit, it's not part of my identity anymore. I never regard myself as still as a lawyer. I'm very proud of that profession and I loved it and I would happily still be doing it, but it's not part of how I see myself now.
I'd love to get into that coaching side because I think it's such a valuable thing, I think, for every board to have that toolkit available to them. And I think it's one of the most important questions every leader has to answer, which is what is the optimal environment for this group to perform at their best? And when we first met, you talked through the 10 characteristics of high-performing teams as being those who are energized by belonging cues, the story of us, vision, optimism, mission clarity, shared values, alignment, feedback as a de-energizer and confronting burnout. I'd love to get your sort of, first of all, thoughts on each of those characteristics and what they mean for boards. And I suppose at two levels, one, the board themselves, but also then for the organizations they govern. And that's no small question there.
I think for everybody, we all have our own way of seeing the world. And for me, it's been massively informed by the fact that I'm a New Zealander. I'm part Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. I'm also part English and I'm part Irish. So that's where all my ancestry really came from. And, as I said, out in belonging, when I was 5 years old, my father passed away very suddenly. He was a young man. And my mother was 39 and was left with a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 5-year-old, which was me and my 3-year-old sister. And as we got a bit older, like everybody, we create an identity story that anchors us. Sometimes they're positive, and for some people, probably they can be negative. But for me, that was frustrating because I felt like I belonged to the English and the Maori and the Irish, but I didn't really feel much connection, particularly to the Maori side, because my father was an only child and he'd gone. So I wrote to the Maori tribe when I was 12, and I basically said, "This is who I am. This is my father. This is my grandmother. Do you know who I am?" And they wrote this, this beautiful letter back to me saying, "We know who you are and you belong here," and gave me generations of ancestors, their names and stories going back 1,000 years. And it gave me just this quite a euphoric sense of being part of something much bigger than myself. And my own identity had been looking for that. I have all my own insecurities and actually what I wanted to feel was part of something special. So that's really informed me, because when I was 12, as well as giving me all that sort of genealogy and great stories, they also explain this concept of whakapapa, WHAKAPAPA, and that informs all my coaching, but also informs how I actually see the role of a board. And what they explained was that every community you are part of, from your family to a business to the school to a sports team, any community you belong to, a nation, each community has an origin story, and everybody who is part of that community have their arms interlinked all the way back to that origin story and all the way into the future to the end of time. And all that really happens in any community is that the sun just slowly moves down this story from that origin story. And so when you are alive, or as we are, where we're on a board, whether we're in these roles, all that really means is the sun is shining on us right now. But it is inherently impermanent. It's shone on others before us, and it's going to shine on others after us. So what I was taught was that even as a 12-year-old, you are a guardian of this community. And what they meant by that was that you need to look to your left, back in time towards an origin story, and understand what is it that we've inherited and we're responsible for and need to take care of. What's our story? What are our rituals? What are our anchors, our values? All of these things. And it creates a line of who we are from a behavioral point of view as well. Then with the sun shining on us, you need to identify what are the opportunities and challenges that we face in this moment. And we need to meet them in order for this community to stay strong. And then the third thing is the future, is that you have a role as a guardian to make sure that whatever we are doing right now will sow the conditions of success for those who will follow. I see everything in that way. And every team I'm part of, from the England football team to the Royal Ballet School to a corporate team, I'm constantly coming back to that frame of reference. Do we really understand what we are the guardians of? Are we anchored in this moment in terms of what we need to do, even if it's uncomfortable and we don't want to do it, we'd rather do something else? Are we addressing that? And finally, are we creating those conditions for people who come after us to be successful? So that to me anchors everything in all the work that I do.
It's so powerful, and on the back of here, you talk about that. You inspired me to implement that in actually one of our offsites, where I got all of the team to write down why they joined, most proud achievement to date, and what they hope to achieve being part of this organization. And we had an artist who took each of those sticky notes and turned it into this amazing sort of timeline, and you could see the organization growing from when we were 4 people away to now where we're sort of almost 70 and growing pretty quickly. And it's a sort of wonderful physical embodiment of that story of us. But why is that so powerful for organizations to have?
I think it taps into a very primal condition of all people, and that is we want to be part of a story. We want to feel a sense of belonging to a community. We don't just want things to be transactional. We want to have an emotional and, in fact, hormonal feeling about this is a great place to be. I feel like I'm respected and I'm seen and I'm heard and I've got a role to play. We are incredibly vision-driven as a species. It's the biggest part of our brain. The most real estate on our brain is dedicated to our visual system, and that's both in terms of not only sight, imagination, and dreaming. So that's really important because as guardians, you need to have a vision of where we want to go to. When we paint these mental pictures for people, it is incredibly motivating, and not just in a fluffy way. Actually, you can look at people's hormonal state. If you as a leader stand before your people and paint a picture of this is the place we want to go, this will be an amazing place where we will be able to thrive, then you can literally measure it with dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin levels surging, And this is the new science really around culture, at this biological level. So these things are really important, but actually our ancestors had a great grasp of all of this. They were very, very good at ritualistically understanding their story and taking it forward and visioning. And, sometimes I talk about an example, which might sound a bit out there, but I actually think it's a good analogy for a lot of current challenges, particularly in business. And that 1,000 years ago, my Polynesian ancestors lived on this quite tiny island, Raratia, 64 square miles. And they'd lived there for a couple of thousand years. And I'll tell you what, they've been friggin' happy there. It was beautiful. It was paradise, I'm telling you. And they had everything they needed. Then this one generation of leaders, what they faced was we couldn't maintain this way of life. There was a climate change going on. The overpopulation started to happen, and actually warring tribes from other islands started to attack them. So we'd had this incredible success, this great life, comfortable, everything we needed. But this one generation of leaders, again, had to answer the question is, what's this moment asking of us? And then the second question is, what do the people who come after us need? And they realized that this was unsustainable. No matter how much they loved it and how comfortable it was not sustainable. They had to go and explore. And so the great epic navigations of the North Pacific, where they discovered Hawaii, the South Pacific, Aotearoa, New Zealand, they went all the way east to South America, up to California. It's the most epic seafaring navigation in human history. This all happened because of that need and because that one leadership group basically decided this was required, and notwithstanding how uncomfortable and painful it was. And they did that, and that's how the Polynesians have prospered. And that's how the Maori are in New Zealand in the first place. So I think it's a good analogy, and it's tough times right now sometimes, and it's just not sustainable. And we can try and hold on to it for ourselves, or we can decide we're going to make some big, tough decisions here. And because the people who come after us need us to do this. And climate change actually on a global level is probably a good example of where that hasn't happened. That has been kicked down for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to deal with. That is not the definition of a great guardian in my culture.
I love that so much. And I loved when you talked in the book about that sort of simplicity of, our purpose being around to sort of feed the village, and how, we've made purpose become unnecessarily complicated and convoluted. And it really helped me actually as a CEO articulate, and think about what's the vision for Nurole and how do I communicate that to my board and to my team, and sort of help me root it back in that, we're building better boards because, better directors make for this better world. I suppose what interests me about that, you've got this wonderful stat that 75% of employees want pictures of their future painted versus business leaders who I think only spend 3% of their time doing so. And I think I very much felt guilty of exactly that. And when I heard you sort of say that, it stung me, and I thought, I've got to do something to change this. Why is that? Why, when we have that need, why as sort of businessy, as sort of CEOs and boards arguably as well, are we so blind to that need?
Well, that came from the Harvard Business Review article that referred to that research. And I really love that, because I do feel it is very much a primal part of who we are, is that we respond well, and we can prove this biologically, to images of optimistic images of what we could be, what we could achieve together. And I, in my own working career, were incredibly frustrated how my leaders would give plenty of KPIs and let's grow at 7.5% this year and all the rest of it, but not any mental pictures of what actually that looked like. And so I've become a bit bold now, and including even, in my humble role on a board, is that when a leader presents the KPIs and strategic objectives, that's great. But they need to be able to back that up with some mental pictures of what the hell does that actually look like in reality. So if we're going to grow at 7.5% and we've identified 3 levers for it, paint some pictures of what that actually looks like when we're doing that successfully. When I first got involved with the FA and England football 6 years ago, just before Gareth Southgate became the manager, the first meeting I had with them, they actually had a strategic objective of being the world number 1 men's team and women's team, but by a certain date. And I actually did ask a question. I said, okay, I get that. I understand your strategic objective, and I can see some of your KPIs underneath that, but I can't see it. If I close my eyes, what does it look like? Is it a team that is playing an attritional style of football and doesn't take any risks and wins 1-0 from a corner? Or is it a team which is very expressive and plays with tempo and is diverse and trusts players to take risks? I can't see any of this. What type of coaching would you need to be the best team in the world? Like that, to that 3-dimensional granularity, to me, is critical to get buy-in and clarity of people. So to their absolute credit, they could have told me, who the hell are you? Don't come back. But actually, Dan Ashworth, Dave Redden, those guys said, come back in a month. And I did. And they said, okay, sit down, close your eyes. This is what it's going to look like. And that is what it has looked like through the last World Cup and the last Euros, is the style of play, the type of player, the environment, the type of coaching. So that to me is a critical thing. It's all very well for any leader to talk about 7.5% growth, whatever it is. I want you. And if you can't do that, if you can't actually paint pictures for us as to how we do it, what it would look like when we're doing it successfully, then I just feel like there's some work you need to do around that.
It resonates so true. When I think of some of the best CEOs that I've worked with, as a private equity investor, they painted that vision. They weren't obsessing about the KPIs. We've worked with some dreadful ones where they were, very KPI oriented, and no one was inspired by them. The really great ones who really did exceptional things were the ones who inspired people with those visions. So that resonates so much. I want to talk more about belonging, which you sort of touched on earlier. How do you create that sense of belonging in a boardroom, do you think? And how do you create that sense of belonging in an organization as a board member? I could well imagine, myself, if I started talking about belonging in the boardroom, they might all look at me and think, oh my gosh, he's finally clocked it now. How should board members be thinking about that?
Well, whether we're talking about, a big organization or the board itself, I think the principles are the same. Belonging is a fundamental human need, and it is actually an incredible performance enabler or disabler. And I say that because if someone has a sense of belonging, they're in a completely different hormonal state than if they feel like an outsider, they feel excluded. So, let's look at it from a behavioral point of view. If I feel a sense of belonging, literally my cortisol, my stress hormones come down, and those dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, they inversely come up. And that's where we want to be, because when my stress is managed from a behavioral point of view, what that means is I'm energized. I'm thinking actually about what the team is trying to do rather than I'm in self-preservation mode, thinking like people don't rate me here. I'm being judged every moment. They may exclude me soon. All of these things aren't dominating your thinking. You're actually thinking about the team. We communicate at a completely different level when we have that calmness and not in that high stress state, including psychological safety, vulnerability. If you don't feel you belong, if you feel that this may end very quickly, that everyone's judging you, everything you do, are you really likely to put your hand up and say, you know what, I'm not 100% clear on what you're asking of me, or I'm not 100% clear on, or there's a gap between what you're asking of me and what I feel my skill set is right now. I need some help. Are you really going to say those things when you're in that, highly stressed state? No, you're not. But if that's all managed and you're feeling that energized by oxytocin, dopamine, etc., you're much more likely to say, this is great, I'm feeling good. Hey, one thing, I didn't 100% understand what you're asking of me in that meeting tomorrow. Can we just go over that again? So we're in a completely different performance state. Also, there's a lot of research which shows how your short-term memory and your cognitive flexibility is massively affected by how much cortisol is in your system. We know that. Like, I make some such dumb decisions when I'm in a panicky, high-stress state compared to when I'm composed. So this is not fluff. A sense of belonging is a massive enabler or disabler of performance, and that's why we go there. And to come back to the question, how do we think about it? Well, the way I think about it, there's two dimensions to belonging. One is the cues that are in an environment, either implicit or explicit. Okay, so that they make a big difference as to how you feel. But the other side of belonging is I need to know the story that I belong to. And that's what I think the role of a leader is that when people are coming in to this is who we are. This is what our story. This is what makes us different. And actually, this is what makes us special. And once that is explained to us, then we have a hormonal reaction to that, and we can attach a sense of belonging to it. But if this is like a law firm, like every other law firm, which getting paid a little bit more money, there isn't any sense of belonging to something special in that sense.
If you're sitting there, say, I'm a chair, and I'm thinking about how to create that sense of belonging with a couple of new board members, and I've approached you and said, "Oh, look, how do I do that?" What would you be saying to me?
Yeah, well, to use a boardroom example, I think you're doing things like, once you decide to appoint this person or offer an appointment to this person, it's not just, we would like you to come and congratulations, whatever. It's like you tell them why. You just be very direct and simple about it, and to say, hey, this is what we love about your experience. This is what we love about your character, your personality. This is how we see you really, really having a positive impact on us. And so that you will get a hormonal reaction to that. Just like some sports teams in particular are very good at that. When someone comes into an environment, there are induction rituals, which actually makes them feel not only that they belong to something special, but they've got a role to play in making them even better and more competitive. So I think that's really important. I think the other part of making someone feel a sense of belonging is to make sure that there's a space created for everyone on the board to actually share a shorthand version of the story of how they got around that table, rather than waiting for cocktail parties or dinners or whatever it is, or traveling together for some of these stories to come out and most of the stories not to come out. Actually creating a space where everybody is able to share that, and then create a space for the new person to also just articulate how they're feeling and from their own personal point of view, what impact they would like to have. I could see easily how people could wait a year or two, and I've heard it on your pod, actually, people talk about this, like they wait a year, 18 months before they really start contributing. That is not high performance. I'm sorry, it's not. High performance is where everybody is performing at a high level from day one. We can't afford to be waiting around for people to get comfortable. So we need to accelerate the whole process. And by really directing belonging cues at them explicitly and quickly, we can move them on and get them to start asking great questions and also being vulnerable.
I love that. What a challenge to all chairs out there to think about, have they got their board members high performing from day one, and have they created that sense of belonging? Just extending that then into thinking about the organization. So same question, you're sitting on a board or working with a chair who's thinking about, have we created that sense of belonging in the organization? What are the sort of questions, you'd be asking around that board table to fathom that?
What I think is really important is for a CEO to have a coherent design on the type of culture they want to build. Not we've got HR policies and we've got all our strategy. That's fantastic. But I want to know, given the challenge we've got, which might be a massive growth opportunity, or we might actually be in survival mode. Whatever the context is, I want to understand what is the blueprint for the culture we need to create in this moment. And there's multiple things, and belonging is part of humans being at their best and feeling energized and safe. But it's not everything. There's a lot of other elements that go to it. And, even we mentioned the word before, optimism. It's actually very, very important. We have a significant hormonal reaction to optimistic narratives versus pessimistic, which won't surprise anybody. But it's important, even if we're panicking ourselves, sometimes the culture, you need an intention to make sure that everyone understands that this is tough. This is very, very tough right now. But if we do these three things, which are in our control, and we create a sense of mission about just nailing these three things right now for this next 3 months, then we'll be okay. But like parenting, COVID, like we don't know and we're a bit panicky ourselves, but actually we're trying to get people in a good hormonal state by being optimistic that if we just do these things, do them well, and stay committed to each other and to the plan, we'll be okay. So these are all very situational. Although, you enjoyed the sort of 10 points I made, I don't ever treat them like a linear model. We do 1, then we go to 2, then we go to 3. I remember a project I did in France for a football team a few years ago was really, I learnt to avoid those linear models, because that was one where A, B, C, D, and E were pretty good, but the team was completely dysfunctional. It was the highest paid team in the competition. It was in the middle of the table. Why? Actually, it was not those normal things. There were 3 alphas at war with each other within that environment, but warring in a reasonably subtle way, but creating 3 distinct cliques who were in basically competition with each other. That was more of a motivator than the team they were playing in the weekend. It's important to have an open mind and just understand what is going on environmentally, culturally.
Got it. You touched on the power of optimism there to create those sort of viral positive loops in an organization. I think the other one I've heard you talking and writing about is feedback as the energizer. How do you think boards should be thinking about feedback? Because it's obviously a critical part of what they are doing.
Yeah, I think the highest standard is that feedback becomes a daily routine. It's just part of who we are and what we do. It's not a big dramatic set piece that happens every 3 or 6 or 12 months like it was when I was a lawyer. This is just, we create an environment where I'm able to say to you, hey, Ollie, today in that meeting, you nailed that. That was outstanding. Like, I knew you were preparing well for it, but you really, really smashed it out of the park. That was great. Or alternatively, in the car on the way back to the airport, rather than, saying nothing, I say to you, hey, can I give you some feedback? I felt like we had a real opportunity when they asked that question to go into our story a bit more. And I felt like you didn't seem very well prepared, for that part of the conversation. What can we learn from that? So just these natural, as you get in a lot of, so-called high-performing environments, it's just all the time. It's just continual conversation. Everyone's feeling psychologically safe, and we can just give each other feedback. And, it's something I enjoy. We have a new exec at Harlequins recently, and I had some awesome feedback from them, from multiple people in the staff. So in the board meeting, like, it was one of the first things when she started speaking and finished the presentation, I just gave her that feedback. I just said, I've heard some fantastic things about how you're doing, the change you've created already, how you're building relationships. So, like, why wouldn't you say that? That energizes people, and I don't know why. We seem to be a bit reticent sometimes of either going into the critical space or even the reaffirming space. That's not high performing to me.
So how do you do that? Because I remember, again, the first time I heard you talking about high performing teams using feedback as an energizer, and you gave the example of, I think it was in a football context, where you talked about the high expectations that you said, look, we signed you because you're the best player, and there's no one faster than you, there's no one more skilled than you. And then you sort of gave them the assurance, and we know you're going to fulfill on these things. And then you gave them a direction of, actually, I think the way you phrased it was, these are the targets we set at the beginning of the season. How do you feel you're doing, and how do you want to close those gaps? And stuff I've read since, I felt like there were maybe some mental models at work that you were using there. So there's one acronym that I've come across of HAID, of High Expectations, Assurance, Direction, which I've slightly clumsily applied to that example. But what do you use for thinking about giving feedback and helping others give feedback, both positive and critical? Are there mental models that you use that others can be making use of?
I think the things that are important to me, we anchor feedback and belonging. And so what I mean by that, and I think you're referring to one of those examples, and as coaches like Gareth Southgate, it's one of his strengths actually, is that, if someone is struggling, he won't just go straight into, like I probably would have as a partner in a law firm, you don't seem to be performing very well. Can we talk about it? What he will say is, let's have a chat about your performance. First thing is, before we do that, this is why I've picked you on this team. This is why you are here. There's a hell of a lot of good players out there, but I chose you. This is what I love about the way you play, your personality, what you bring to the team, your character, all these things. So that's a first. And then the second thing is, because he's had a one-on-one with everybody on an ongoing basis, he will say, this is the vision we've spoken about of who you could be. You could become a world-class player. And we've talked about it, and we've co-created those mental pictures that go with that. So what's the gap between how you feel you're performing now and that version of yourself? So that creates a completely different hormonal state than someone who's clearly feeling under pressure, who's getting dragged in by the coach or a CEO or any leader and being asked to basically explain themselves. So that's a big part of it. I think the second big thing about feedback when it works really, really well is we try and objectify it as much as possible. What I mean by that is we have a real clarity about what we're trying to do as a team or an organization or a board, and we set some standards across that. So these are things that are discussed and socialized, and we're all clear on it. And the metaphor I use is a line. It's like we create a line, quite a high line, and we want to live above the line in terms of our behaviors and the way we operate and perform. We do not want to live below the line. So a team like the South African cricket team I worked with for quite a long time, every time they gave feedback to each other, they felt like they were personally criticizing their colleague, and they just hated it and they didn't want to do it. And also there was a complexity there, which you can imagine. So the way we avoid is trying to objectify it. And that is to say, hey, my friend, I'm going to challenge you if that's okay. Today in that meeting, I think I saw something which, that line we talk about of the best version of us, I felt like I saw something below the line. When that young player put his hand up and said, I think I've got an idea for this next game, and I felt like you really shut him down quite quickly and sort of a little bit brutally. And I think that will probably shut him. He probably won't put his hand up in a meeting now for a long time, and neither will the other junior players. So I'm just going to challenge you on that and give you some feedback on that. I know you didn't have any malice, but I just feel that wasn't the best version of ourselves. We want to empower people and give them space. So, but I could have got that wrong. You tell me. And we started to do that, and it was unbelievable. It was caught on like wildfire as they would go to each other and say, can we have a coffee? I think I saw something below the line. That's another thing for me. And, if you're on a board, you're really clear about what you're trying to do and the way you're going to go about it. And, so in a sports organization, for example, we might lose 4 games in a row in the season. Now, we've actually mentally prepared that, and we've created mental pictures in advance of that happening. And so we know how we're going to respond. Above the line means we don't say anything to the media. We don't start sending text messages at 2:00 in the morning to the coach like some teams do. We don't do those things. We just keep nice and composed. We stick to the process, and we let and we're there as supportive in a supportive sense. So if someone's not doing that and they're panicking or making comments or being sharp or saying something in the media, then we're able to pull them up. Even a junior guy like me on the board, like, hey, I thought we talked about living above the line this season would be that, and so can I challenge maybe the way that you spoke to the newspaper around this recent poor form?
Oh, it makes me feel like I want to go and put on my football boots now. You're sort of inspiring me, feeling like I could go play for that team. Fantastic. You touched on values earlier and shared values. And again, that often feels like quite a nebulous thing for the boardroom, quite intangible, difficult for people to grasp. But ultimately, the board is responsible for setting the values within an organization. What, as you sit in your board role, how do you think about those values? What are the questions you're asking as a board member, and for chairs and board members thinking about that? What are the things they should be keeping in mind?
Your values, to me, are an essential part of your identity story. And I know this sounds a bit flippant, but it's not. Your values are the traits or the beliefs that this community value. That's what it means. So I think it's important to be a guardian. You need to not only know the story, the heritage, the history, all of those things, but you need to know what is the shorthand version of that. And that's what, to me, the values should be. And they should all be wrapped in stories. And again, I'm happy to use Harlequins as an example. I did a review sort of 18 months ago or whenever, and then I was subsequently invited onto the board. But when I did my review, I think there were about 4 sets of values in the organisation. I think HR had a set, I think the men's team had their own set, the women's had their own set, and I think the board had done an exercise with a consultant, had their own set, right? So there wasn't a coherent belief system or value system. There were all these different words. Now, I went excavating as part of my work. And what was interesting, when I spoke to players and staff, they kept saying we had a really coherent articulation under Conor O'Shea when he was the coach. And it was under the acronym of TRUE. T, tempo, R, relate, U, unconventional, and E, enjoy. And so they started to share these great stories of what those words look like and where they came from. And then we started to talk to Connor, and then what he said those words came from actually Adrian Stoop, who's like our spiritual founding father in the early 1900s. And actually, he wanted the team to play with more tempo and to express themselves and enjoy themselves and be unconventional and unorthodox. So then all of a sudden, we've got this identity story of Harlequins, which we'd sort of drifted away from. We were able to knit it all back together, not only to Connor 10 years ago, but actually all the way back 110, 120 years ago. So now we've got this amazing story, and it's inspirational for the people involved in the club, but it's distilled into the shorthand, which is these 4 values. And so now all of the organisation, not just the performers, all of the organisation, their teams define what true means for them using those 4 values. And then every individual has an opportunity to define what those values look like in a very personal way for them. But also, this is the second year in a row now where the board have done exactly the same thing. So we've got those 4 values around true. So what's tempo? What do we really need to get done as a board now? Not in 2 years, but now what is urgent? Relate. What are the key relationships that the board need to have, and how strong are they, and what work do we need to do around that? Unconventional. Are we continually looking for options that aren't conventional? And then what does enjoyment look like for being on the board here? I mean, what does that look like? So we every year now ask those same questions, and we are clear on what those values would look like if we're living them as a board.
Is the significance of that in the process or the end goal? I mean, if I think about, our own values as an organization, our internal team, we have build trust, because everything starts with trust. We have be bold, which is all about, changing the environment that we're operating in, and it's about operating at a sort of excellence in everything we do in standards. And then it's about be better, which is that growth mindset of understanding that compound interest is the 10th wonder of the world, and that we haven't evolved to think exponentially. And so that goes through everything we do. And when we look at our outstanding new rollers, or that they'll be assessed against those. But when I look around at other organizations, I sort of can see, I can map their values onto our values. And if I think about some of the boards I sit on, they have some values, but actually, if you tore them up on the ground and put them with a whole group of other groups' values, it'd be quite hard potentially to distinguish between them. So what is it that I suppose is the essence of it? Is it that process of building the values and sharing that process, or do you think it's the values themselves that matter?
I don't really want to come across as like I'm the big expert on all this, because I've really got my own approach, and that's the only thing I'm an expert on probably. But I come back to my earlier point. I mean, what is it that this particular community value as a trait? Mm-hmm. And you can only answer that by knowing what the stories are. So to me, the values should emerge naturally from the story of understanding the story of who we are. So, and I'll give you a pretty dramatic example of it. When I was that 12-year-old boy that I mentioned before, the tribe took particular effort to explain to me the story of my grandmother 5 generations ago, whose name was Pakanui. And so what they said to me was that part of who we are is we are resilient people. So you could say that's a value. And they said to me, you are a resilient person. I didn't even know what that meant. And they said, we're going to prove to you why that is the case. And they told me various stories from our identity, but in particular around Pakanui, who was, as a little girl, her village was attacked and there was a great massacre, and she managed to escape it with some older people. When she was 14 and 15, she was raped by European whalers and had children to both of them. When she was 18, they were removed from the land and was given to white settlers, and they were landless again. When she was 19, she was baptized, and she had her name replaced, was given an anglicized name, and so were her children. And they were told never to speak Maori and to tell those stories and those myths, and that there's only one God and there's only one book. So they told me all these stories, and what they were doing is saying that she was one of the most positive, charismatic people that we can remember. Your life probably won't have the adversity that she had, but whatever adversity it does have, understand that by being part of this family, this tribe, this community, you are a resilient person. And so that's my approach, is that we want to get those stories and we want to explain to people that this is part of who we are. And even if you don't feel like that's a personal strength of yours, actually, when we are together, it is a collective strength of ours.
Love that. I just want to wrap up with the sort of high-performing characteristics and the final one around confronting burnout, which strikes me as being more critical right now than it's ever been before, with some amazing stats around how many people are suffering with burnout at the moment. How do you think about burnout as a performance coach, and how do you think boards should be thinking about that?
I think about burnout, I actually think a lot of it is to do with our hormonal biological state, as I mentioned before. If we are in a constant chronic stress situation, we will burn out. Of course we will. I mean, that's well established, isn't it? So what I'm interested in a sustainable, high-performing environment is that we have an environment where people are having that stress managed well, even in very high scrutiny environments like the England football team. We are still in our day-to-day environment managing that. So we're not marinating in adrenaline and cortisol, which is burning us out. We actually have lots of dopamine, oxytocin, which is making us incredibly energized. So we need great storytelling from our leaders about this is a story. This is a chapter we're writing right now. This is going to be friggin' amazing. This is going to be one of the best experiences of your life. This is hard. This is not easy, but we together can achieve something special. So it's always that sort of narrative that is energizing people in a sustainable way. So that's how I think about burnout, is we can actually work friggin' hard and relentlessly and go at it, but we need an environment which is making us in a certain state as opposed to that chronic stress state, which I don't think is sustainable for people.
And so boards, I mean, I remember the sort of wonderful insight you shared around the hormonal profile of a team leading up to a match day and how they change. How should boards be thinking about that? Should they be starting to sort of get into that detail, do you think, of both at the board level and at the organizational level? Or are there other things that they can be doing to think about how best to confront it?
I actually think in the next decade, this whole hormonal biological way of understanding culture is going to become pretty ubiquitous, because there are definitely sports teams in the world in particular who are all over this. They have endocrinologists who have come in, observed their rhythm of working and given them some very direct advice as to what's good and what needs to move. And, I've seen it. I've talked to the people involved, how they've come into some very successful teams and said, you know what? You're actually a bit crazy the way you do things. You are losing so much energy at the start of the week by these aggressive meetings, these very confrontational way of leading, this very outcome focused without the mental pictures, all of this stuff. You're actually creating a lot of stress here. You're creating a lot of stress. And oxytocin, you're not making any space in your rhythm for people to connect with each other and energize themselves in that way. And also your lack of a vision and your lack of continually telling how the story is evolving, except, every quarter where there's a statistic, that is also causing a lot of stress. You would have a lot less stress in the system if people, as well as the, quarterly stats, also understood that this is the big picture of what we're trying to achieve. And actually, you know what? We're having some really good small wins on the way there. Even those communicating, storytelling the small wins as we go, gives confidence, gives beliefs, and changes our hormonal state. So, I actually 100% think we're going to become very scientific about it. We're going to get people to come in and help us understand this stuff. And, I'm seeing that happen in other environments already. And that is a wonderful way of avoiding burnout. And also, one thing I've challenged as well is in high-performing environments, the athletes go in every morning and they will register how much sleep they've had, their nutrition, hydration, and they'll be asked to score between 1 and 10 their mood on that day and their energy on that day. And all of that data is captured and retained, and every individual has a benchmark around those things. So people can quickly see where they are at any point in time. Why do we not do that for all our other performers? Why we don't do that for athletes? This, to me, is absolutely crazy. So I think going forward, we'll use technology and data in that way to keep a better hold and understanding on how the collective where they are from an energy point of view, from a burnout point of view.
Makes huge sense. Actually, you shared, I think it was that the New Zealand government used this framework of the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being, which actually I've taken and I use in our all-hands meetings now as a sort of CEO. And I challenge each of the team to score themselves in private on the call, how they're doing on each of those fronts, and then to set themselves one thing that they would like to do between now and the next all-hands that we have, and to diarize it, half an hour to move the dial on one of those things. And again, I think at the time, our well-being scores through our people analytics stuff have since gone up 5x on the back of doing not only that, but that's certainly one thing. So that's been hugely powerful as an insight for me thinking about running the organization. And it sort of makes me think more of how, as a board member, I should be challenging the companies to think more about that.
Just in the sense of the social well-being, but we focus on emotional well-being and making sure we've got the support and the policies and counselling and whatever. But what sometimes is missed is that no matter how mentally strong, in inverted commas, someone is, if they're put in a compromised or even toxic environment, okay, it's going to de-energize them. It's going to take them away from the best version of themselves and their best performance. So it's really important, and even on a board, you understand that are there pockets within a business where actually there is a toxic or a compromised environment, and is that a contributor to the underperformance? And the other things that I would look to as well is making sure the social well-being isn't just a nice fluffy thing; it's an absolute essential to high performance.
What do you look for there? Because there's, I think business leaders often wrestle with sometimes, high performers, and I think you've talked about this, is that sort of classic environment where it requires high levels of stress to perform. And for me, the paradigm was always the Alex Ferguson school of hairdryer treatment versus the Arsene Wenger kind of finding your inner sort of peace. How do you know and think about as a board member, or if you're talking to boards, about whether or not behaviors are toxic? And then you've talked in the past about the skill of great leaders being able to accommodate difficult personalities when it's easy just to remove them, but actually, how do you bring them in? How do you think about that line between sort of toxic behavior, difficult leaders, and getting the best out of the organization?
A few years ago, I was asked to go into one of the British Olympic sports and be on a panel to observe them for a week or so. And on the very last day that we were all together, there's 5 of us on the panel. It was a wonderful experience. But on the very last day, the top national coaches were all introduced into the gym, and we were sat there and observed. And and this was something which is obviously going to be very interesting. So what we observed was 12 national coaches, and at one end of the gym was a coach I would say would qualify as a bully. I would say quite a toxic environment, very aggressive, very confrontational, causing huge spikes in adrenaline and cortisol for sure. And at the other end of the gym, we had someone who was engaging in the Socratic method. How did you feel you trained today? How did you feel we were clear around what we're trying to achieve? What feedback can you give me as your coach around how I could have done a better job today? What do we want to do now? All that type of thing. And at the end of it, we went into the boardroom and we were asked by the organisation, so, what sort of words would you use to describe our culture? And I answered, I wouldn't know where to start, because it depends what part of the gym we're at. And to me, that's exactly the same in a corporate sense. Have we, as part of our identity, clarity and alignment on what the best environment is for our people? Or do we actually, delegate that or subcontract that down to individual managers to do whatever mirrors their personality or their preferences or style? Because that is not high performance. It's not even coherent. That's a starting point. It's not just a matter of getting some data and attrition rates and looking for bad performance and trying to figure it out. I want to know, and that's part of, I feel like, a role of a board, is need to be reassured and maybe even help around that. Have we got a coherent and clear idea of what we really believe in to get the best out of our people? Now, I'm not saying it isn't a bit contextual. Sometimes when you have very inexperienced group, you've got to be quite directive with them. Understand that. Still compassionate, but directive. Sometimes we got a very experienced group of people. Actually, you can step back and empower them. So I understand it's contextual, but we should have some fundamental beliefs, including the idea of social well-being, that everybody is signed up to. And my friend, you cannot be part of us if you've got a completely different belief system and behavioral code.
So what would be some examples of what that might look like?
Well, some of the fundamentals are we believe that everybody thrives when they have a sense of belonging. So we want them to be connected to the story of us. So even though you might not be the great storyteller or whatever, that you need to curate the story for them to understand this is what we're about. We believe strongly in feedback in real time. Okay, it might not be easy, might be something you experience, but this is what we'll coach you, we'll help you. But this is what we believe, that everybody will perform and improve and grow quicker and correct things that need to be corrected if there's a real feedback environment. Everybody should have mental pictures of what, in their own context, their best performance looks like, but also what the team's trying to achieve. So that visioning piece is really, really important. We love our diversity. We love it. But inclusiveness needs to involve, we all buy into some shared values. So you need to have these values in your team that everybody is bound to, notwithstanding we celebrate their own diversity. So if those 3 values or 4, if we have at Harlequins, create that space, articulate them, and allow every individual to give them personal meaning. So there are things like that we can require of everybody, and they can bring it in their own way, in their own personality, in their own style, right? We don't want clones of each other, but we do have some fundamental beliefs on what's going to be a high-performing environment and what's going to not be.
I love that. You very modestly said before this podcast, look, I'm not a board expert, but you have started your own board journey, and you started as a consultant and were pulled in because the value you were adding was just so significant. That's my perspective on it, not yours. But how are you better as a board member now versus when you first started the role? Because I got no doubt you're going to continue to go from strength to strength as a board member, and I can see, in a sense, every board probably should have an Owen on it, driving that performance, helping them think about that performance. But how are you evolving as a board member? What are you better at now than when you first started?
I think the genesis of me, now being on my second board in this type of role is that I see myself in some ways as a bridge between, the board and the performance side of the business. Because you can be too differential to that, okay, well, they are doing their thing. I don't quite understand exactly how they do it or what's involved, so we defer. And in sport, you can see, for example, the board may not be people who've played the game or coached the game at a high level, so they can become quite differential. But I don't see how you hold people really accountable and they're clear on how well they're doing their roles unless you do have some form of understanding. So, for example, with Harlequins, what we have done is, as well as our financial planning and our marketing planning, we have a performance plan. Simple as that. The performance part of our business creates a performance plan. So from a performance point of view, what are we trying to do in the next 3 years? What are we trying to do this year? And what are the absolutely core strategic things that we need to address in order to make us more competitive? And that can include the academy and pathways, and it can include culture, it can include our coaching capability, all sorts of different things. So the board signs off on that. And that's how we hold some accountability. And then they will come and talk to how the performance is going beyond the scoreboard and whether these things in the background are being done. And if not, try and help them. So I don't see what the difference would be anywhere, is that ultimately this is about human performance, isn't it? And so why wouldn't we hold people accountable and have a point of view on what that looks like, both strategically and behaviorally? So, and the other, I suppose for me, it's confidence is just such a massive element of performance. It doesn't matter how much experience you've got. If you don't feel confident and you don't feel you belong, you're going to not share. You're not going to contribute, right? So I've been very fortunate in the board I'm in now, in particular, very, very kind people, even though they've been on the board for a long time and very experienced. I always feel like my voice is valued and they want me to contribute, And that's allowed me to find my voice. And although I'm used to speaking in other environments, not really used to speaking in a boardroom, but now I'm starting to find my voice. And that's given me confidence, and hopefully, I'm contributing something positively.
Oh, and the time has flown by, and I could keep talking for hours and hours, but I'm sadly going to have to move into the wrap-up session. Already late on that. I haven't been just able to stop. The first part of that, I think you'll appreciate, is a new section we've introduced called the Pass Along question, where one of our previous guests has asked a question that I'll ask you. You haven't heard it before. Fits very much into the Whakapapa model of being in that chain of people, and then we'll move on to the 5-question quickfire. So the pass along question is, assuming we want to improve the diversity of boards in the next 20 years, what do we need to do differently?
Yeah, one of my first experiences when I came back to the UK in 2018 from a couple of years living in New Zealand was I'd enjoyed being on the board in New Zealand, and I thought I'd love to do that again. Actually, that was really real fun. But I spoke to a few headhunters around NED type roles, and they both said to me, to be perfectly honest, sending your CV to us isn't going to make any difference. It's going to be around you networking. These appointments made through network, and I did find that a little bit depressing because not everybody is well networked. Not everybody has great connections. In fact, I wouldn't regard myself as one of those. And that feels just too exclusive to me. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, but I do think it's really, really important. People like talking about diversity and inclusion, but, opportunity for people in the first place. So hopefully maybe some of those prior models of how we identify the right fit, people brave, take a bit more risk, and introduce some very different backgrounds and ways of thinking, and be brave to do that. Be good role models to do that too.
Thank you. And then the 5-question quickfire, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Okay.
So the best book every board member should read, and why? Other than Belonging, of course.
No, not at all. No, I wouldn't. Well, I feel a bit presumptuous in some ways the way you say that, but there's a book called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is the head of neuroscience at Stanford University, quite an amazing individual, an academic, but writes incredibly beautifully and simply as well. But his book Behave really is all about this idea that behavior is very much determined by your hormonal state. And he goes in, some of it's a bit heavy possibly around the scientific side of it, but that completely opened my eyes. Because we talk about behaviour and we either shout at people or we put their arm around. Well, it's a little bit amateur once you actually read Behave by Sapolsky. It's very much that people will behave in very predictable ways depending on their hormonal states. I just think that is so much potential to unlock great leadership going forward, thinking about that. So Behave by Sapolsky.
I love that. I've not read that one, so I'll add it to my list. I know from the book list on your book, Belonging, you had many of my favourite books. So I imagine that's another classic. I'll look forward to reading that. And it reminds me actually of sometimes see my toddlers screaming. And, sometimes as a parent made the mistake of trying to meet fire with fire. And then actually, that never works. And reminding yourself to sort of reset them. And then actually we've all got our inner toddlers screaming inside us. And we just need to remember that we've got, most of us have got better at controlling it most of the time. That again resonates a lot. Your favorite quote and why?
Well, my favorite quote actually is my mother's quote to me, which was, I came from a very grounded, humble background, which I'm grateful for. And her quote was, "Never judge a day at lunchtime."
I love that.
And like if I achieved something or came back and showed off about something, she'd always say, "Okay, that's good. Just don't judge a day at lunchtime, will you?" I like that. And actually, in the sport that in particular, you've got to have a sort of an outlook a bit like that, because there's going to be these great moments, but there's going to be equally, if not more, really difficult moments where everybody thinks that you're hopeless and you're the wrong people in the wrong roles and all of that. And it's just important to have like a long-term vision of what you're trying to achieve, your sort of clear sense of your impact and your strengths, and stay aligned to that, not get too up and down as we go along.
I love that. Reminds me of the Herodotus line of never judge a man happy until he's on his deathbed, which is another great one. Best ever holiday and why?
Well, this is probably a poor answer, but I'd say my last one, which was our family. We went to the Ile de Ré in France, just off the coast from La Rochelle. We had been there about 3 years ago with our very good French friends, and then we'd missed it with COVID, and we went back this year. And it's just 60 kilometres, cycling track, 8 different beaches. But the thing that makes it actually even more special was our French friends, the husband, his family have lived in that village, and you can see in the cemetery for 900 years. So so for our children, just an unbelievable experience. You go there, they know every single nook and cranny, every part of history, where to go for this, where to go for the oysters, everything. And it's just took the whole holiday to a completely different level if we had rocked up and stayed in a hotel and did those sorts of things. So, just the beautiful people that we spend time with, I suppose. They're just so welcoming. And I know it sounds a bit corny, but they actually give us a great sense of belonging in that place.
Sounds fantastic. And last but not least, your favorite app. And I know you try to avoid apps and set a good example to your kids. So maybe you should update that to your favorite life hack.
I am conscious of the devices, and I'm also conscious of being a bit of a hypocrite around them with my children and their own behaviour. So yeah, I'm not encouraging more use necessarily. I think, again, life hack might not be the right expression, but I think it's important when you're busy and you're operating in high pressure environments that you've got real clarity on how you personally recover. And for me, actually exercising, which might sound like surely that's going to tire you out, but actually I get a huge amount of recovery and re-energization from exercise. But that's not for everybody. But so I'm always checking in with people, like, just if you whatever it is, have you got real clarity on how you recover, how you de-stress, and then start replenishing your energy? Doesn't matter what the hell it is, but you just got some clarity around that. I think that's really, really important. And I'm enjoying, introducing my kids to that way of thinking as well.
Fantastic. And I just realized I missed your most significant professional insight. Almost gave you the easy one out there.
As context is everything. And when I started this work as a performance coach, I had a sort of a bit of a model, which was based on some good stuff and some good teams. But, I realized I'd take it and say, okay, this is the model to be a high performing team. And actually it didn't quite fit either them or the moment they were in. So that's what I've learned, is just to be, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but just to sort of shut up, observe, listen, have great conversations when I go into a team, sometimes even for months at a time, and then start to feed back, play back, and share ideas with them. So that's a big part of my methodology. Probably mad from a consulting sales point of view to have that type of approach, but I feel like that's how I have an impact, is immersing myself very deeply and with some care and compassion, and then feeding back later once got a bit of confidence around what is in the road between them and their vision being realized, and what are the things that we need to shift in order to create a flow towards it.
Owen, thank you so much. You've been absolutely inspirational. It's been a privilege listening to you. As I said at the beginning, you've already helped me hugely as a CEO and a board member, and I hope others will benefit as much as I have from this discussion. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you for inviting me on your very cool pod.